Good afternoon. Is this Vespers?
Vespers, yes.
My name is Paul Elie. I'm a senior fellow in the Berkley Center here at Georgetown and an author. And I'm pleased to host this final session of the afternoon. Newman the writer, new perspectives on his role in literature and culture. Who is the greatest writer? The question is posed to Stephen Dedalus in James Joyce's Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. Stephen noted the mockery in the question and said, I'm not going to attempt an Irish accent. Of prose, do you mean? Yes. Newman, I think. Is it Cardinal Newman? Asked Boland. Yes, answered Stephen. The grin broadened on Nash's freckled face as he turned to Stephen and said, And do you like Cardinal Newman, Dedalus? Oh, many say that Newman has the best prose style, Aaron said to the other two in explanation. Of course, he's not a poet.
Well.
I was struck by this passage when I was trying for the first time to make sense of the Portrait of the Artist as a teenager, and have really puzzled over it ever since, wondering what's going on in the passage. Is Joyce, who was notorious for his attempt to just render what people would actually say, simply recording with fidelity the kind of questions that would be posed in the circle of Jesuit-educated Irish Catholics in which Stephen Dedalus moved? Or was he suggesting, in a way, the narrowness of Daedalus's literary experience at that point, that he and his friends could talk about the greatest writer, including Shakespeare and Tennyson, and you name it, that they would name Newman? Or was he tipping his hat sideways to this writer for whom he retained some admiration? Or was it all these things together? Well, I've wondered, and I'm not sure we'll nail down the answer to that question on this panel, but I hope it's an appropriate starting off point to talk about future perspectives for Newman as a writer. Let me introduce the other panelists first of all. Patrick O'Malley, to my immediate left, is professor of English here at Georgetown. Expertise in the 19th century British literature and culture, gender and sexuality, the Gothic novel, religion and literature, Irish and Anglo-Irish history and literature, and literary theory. In addition to 2 books, he's published articles and essays on, among others, Wilde, Joyce, Anne Radcliffe, and John Henry Newman. Thank you for coming and joining us. Mark Bosco, a colleague here in the middle, is Vice President for Mission and Ministry at Georgetown, and also a professorial lecturer in the English department. Mark taught previously in theology and English literature at Loyola of Chicago, and served as director of the Joan and Bill Hanks Center for Catholic Intellectual Heritage. His scholarly work focuses on the intersection of theology and art, and you're one of the producers of a forthcoming documentary film about Flannery O'Connor, Flannery, the Storied Life of the Writer from Georgia. Mark Gallagher is a PhD candidate in the English department at UCLA. His dissertation is focusing on post-secularism, a big word here at Georgetown where Jose Casanova has done so much to advance our understanding of the post-secular, and spirit in the transcendentalist movement. His writings have appeared in New England Quarterly, ESQ, Emerson Society Papers, Thoreau Society Bulletin, and Commonweal. And it's the piece that was in Commonweal on Newman as novelist that is going to be the basis for his remarks here today. He attended the Lumen Christi Institute seminar on Newman at Merton College, Oxford. So thanks to all 3 of you for joining us here. There's no question that Newman is a figure of huge symbolic importance for the literary culture of Anglophone Catholicism. His own work, a novel, poetry, prose autobiography, sermons, the essay on development that was discussed so much today, the Grammar of Assent. So the work that he did as a cleric who was also a writer, the fact that he was a cardinal registered very importantly. He played a crucial role in the conversions of Hopkins and others of that generation, really the next generation of English Catholic writers. And then after he was dead, a crucial role in the next generation of English Catholic writers who read his works and saw in his work possibilities for an English language Catholic literature, and also saw possibilities transcending the kind of class and ethnic divisions that had riven the church up to that point. I mean the controversialist Belloc and Chesterton and Ronald Knox, and then the novelists Graham Greene, Evelyn Waugh, and Muriel Spark, about whom I think we'll hear more in the next few minutes. Then, through Newman's presence in their imaginative lives, he had a further presence when those writers influenced the American Catholic writers who emerged more or less after the war in this country, partly through their own works. Merton, Walker Percy, Dorothy Day, Powers, and the like, and partly through the considerable influence of Newman on their readers, the Catholic generation that went to school on the GI Bill and bought image books, and the whole line of Newman's works was available in the image editions. I know I had the Grammar of Assent in a very stiff image edition that my father had read at St. Mary's Seminary in Baltimore in the 50s. So his work was spread that way as well. It's not incidental that the site of a lot of Catholic literary activity, both in England and the United States after the war, was at Newman centers, at American or at colleges and universities. That's caught really well in David Lodge's novel, How Far Can You Go, which attempts to kind of push the Catholic novel from the Newman Center to some sort of postmodern, post-60s reality. So Newman runs through all of this as a hugely important symbolic figure. I guess my question is, to what extent is Newman important as an actual literary figure today? It's hard to tell. In preparing for the conference, I looked around for evidence of traces of his voice in the works of contemporary writers. There are fewer than you might think, but that I'm taking as an occasion to use this panel discussion to sort of have each of us speak to an aspect of Newman's work and seed the ground for further developments. It strikes me, just meeting the four of us getting together today, that as far as I can tell, we're all of the generation born during the council or after, and that may be significant for our remarks, because the question for Newman, for that Anglo-Catholic literary tradition, is what has happened to it since the Second Vatican Council. How crucial was Newman's influence on the council, or did it, in some respects, do away with the church that, or the furniture, at least, of the church that is so strong in his work? So those are some of the sorts of things that I hope we'll take up. Mark is going to begin by talking about Newman as novelist. Mark Bosco will talk about Newman's poetry and the Apologia and how they were different ways of exploring some of the same questions. And Patrick will talk about a reading of the Apologia and how it changes as he approaches it, reading it in different ways over the years. Myself, I'm here just as the person who was knocked out by Newman as a reader. 1986, Westminster Cathedral, summer abroad, got this groovy edition of the Apologia, introduction by Maisie Ward, really strong piece of writing in itself. Went around England under the spell of Newman, reading on trains and swallowing whole his interpretation, which I think is pretty strong in the Apologia, of Catholicism as real Christianity and the Anglican Church as a mere national institution, and feeling wounded town after town to get off and see these beautiful churches and know that this person who had bewitched me with his prose and the sensitivity of his judgments would also, and correct me if I'm overreading the negative aspect of the book, but these were churches that he assessed as essentially dead or as essentially illegitimate. And it was a confounding experience, and one that I haven't gotten over and have really tried to sort out ever since. In the same way, all of you who've read the Apologia know that at a crucial moment in the memoir, what Newman does is look back to the 4th century and try to figure out where he and his contemporaries would be if they were having out the heresies of the 4th century. The Catholic Church would be where she is now, and the Anglicans would be the heretics, I think, is the way he put it. Well, for myself, I read the Apologia, and I knew that I was one of the liberals, that he has such strong words for, the words that I read earlier today. So to feel indicted as a free-thinking liberal and also attracted by Newman's charm and prose and intellect and sensitivity was to feel pulled in 2 directions by this powerful text, and read it again several times and have felt that again and again. I hope that, if anything, I've become a little bit more Catholic by Newman standards through the reading of the Apologia. Here's hoping so. So, all that said, let's hear from the 3 panelists, and then we'll have some free conversation from there. Thank you. Mark?
Thank you, Paul. St. John Henry Newman has the distinction of being the first and only saint thus far who can be called a novelist. Newman is best known in the English literary tradition for the idea of a university and the Apologia, Pro Vita Suda. Much lesser known today are his 2 novels. The semi-autobiographical Loss and Gain, published in 1848, and the historical romance Callista, published in 1856. Generations of Catholics have read these early Catholic novels as a way to encounter the mind of Newman, as an aid in their spiritual formation. But what can be said of Newman's novels as works of literature? What is the literary value of them? What is their place in the English literary canon? As someone who studies the religion and literature of the 19th century, primarily American literature, I focus on the forms religious writers and spiritual seekers choose to express their ideas. For Newman, these include essays, sermons, and poems. But I'm particularly interested in Newman's novels. The religious or theological novel that is Loss and Gain was a popular subgenre in the Victorian era, which called itself the age of faith and doubt. And as novels in the English literary tradition, or as a novelist in the English literary tradition, Newman had to contend with the fact that the English novel had a strong association with a secular romanticism and a strong attachment to an English identity that was oftentimes hostile to Catholicism. His novels were written during our emerging secular age. Secularity can refer to the disenchantment of the world and the subtraction of religion from the public sphere, but it also is marked by new conditions of belief that philosopher Charles Taylor says allows for a culture in which a plurality of religious and non-religious practices coexist without any one appearing as inevitable. Such was the climate of England in the mid-19th century. It was marked by religious controversy and the romantic religion of the self. Loss and Gain is a Catholic interpretation of this history, and I argue that Newman is the novelist for our secular age, as he was in his own. Indeed, Loss and Gain is, in ways, a secular novel as much as it is a religious novel, secular in Charles Taylor's formulation. And perhaps it should be emphasized that it is also amongst the earliest English Catholic novels. So in ways, Newman initiated the tradition of the English Catholic novel. Both of Newman's novels, written after his conversion to Catholicism, depict characters who share conversion experiences similar to his own, and whose fictional lives illustrate what he thought of as the first principles of Catholicism. They describe what faith feels like in times and places when individuals experience hostility and even persecution for their Catholic faith. And while they have a tendency to be didactic, they are not like so many other religious novels which function merely as fictional apologetics. Newman made an effort to keep his theological arguments out of his books. What he does instead, I argue, is reinterpret the forms of the English novel, the traditional forms of the English novel, to show how suitable they are to the story of an English Catholic, just like Newman. I call this Newman's act of literary conversion. I hope to say a few words about what I mean by literary conversion and how Newman accomplishes this in his first novel, Loss and Gain, while saying a little more, that's a Newman pun. I hope to say a little more on Newman as a novelist and the history and reception of Loss and Gain. Newman once scoffed at the idea that he, a novel-writing priest, could ever be a saint. He said, I have nothing of a saint about me, as everyone knows, as he writes in a letter to an admirer sometime after he had begun writing his second novel. Saints are not literary men. They do not love the classics. They do not write tales. This quotation is sometimes cited as an example of Newman's humility, but he was clearly proud of his status as a literary man. It is also telling of Newman's own conflicting feelings about the moral value of literature. Newman, however, was most certainly a novelist, albeit a minor one, though it should be remembered that after nearly 2 decades of sermons and theological writings, Newman's first published work after becoming a Catholic was a novel. That novel, Loss and Gain, intended to describe, quote, the course of thought and state of mind of Newman's own conversion experience. Before 1848, there had been few English novels that were sympathetic to Catholicism. The religious or theological novel in the Victorian era was a genre for the religious thought of mostly Protestants. Loss and Gain is the story of a young Oxford student, Charles Redding, who seeks faith amid the religious climate of the Tractarian controversy of the 1830s and 1840s. The novel offers parody versions of the same religious factions Newman encountered as a student at Oxford. Evangelical and high church Anglicans engage the protagonists in debates about belief and true religion. Newman gives a voice to the experience, a self-consciously English voice that expresses a dissatisfaction with the superficiality of theological debate before finding spiritual fullness in the community of the Catholic Church. Loss and Gain contains satiric elements which make parts of it read like the script of a Victorian-era situation comedy, with passages of serious religious controversies alternating with more lighthearted dialogue that dismisses or deflates the pretensions of systematic theology. The genre it most closely resembles is the Bildungsroman. As a coming-of-age story about a sensitive soul's education, Newman's protagonist embarks on a religious quest. He rejects the social influences of his time and ultimately his own subjectivity in assenting to his Catholic faith. The Bildungsroman can be traced back to Goethe's Wilhelm Meister's apprenticeship. Thomas Carlyle's 1824 English translation of that was popular reading in Oxford during Newman's tenure. And Goethe's novel is in ways philosophical as Newman's is theological, marked by the disillusionment of its main character, who ultimately finds happiness in family life. Newman's interpretation, as I said, is similar. His journey follows Redding through a world of theological rather than philosophical ideas, and where he ultimately arrives at a happiness found not in the immanence of family life, but in the transcendence that comes when his protagonist assents to faith. It is no coincidence that Loss and Gain, a kind of autobiographical Bildungsroman, has so much in common with a later, much better known novel, James Joyce's A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. As Paul pointed out, Newman was a major influence on Joyce. A Portrait of the Artist, like Joyce's posthumously published Stephen Hero, follows the life of its protagonist through his university education, complete with the lectures he attends and his conversations with fellow classmates. Like Stephen in A Portrait, who believed Newman to be, quote, the greatest writer, Joyce felt, quote, that nobody has ever written English prose that can be compared with that of a tiresome footling little Anglican parson who afterwards became a priest of the only true church. If readers pick up Loss and Gain today, it is most likely because they are looking for insight into Newman's own life and especially his conversion. Nor will they be disappointed, for the novel is in some ways even more revealing than Newman's more straightforward history of his religious opinions in the Apologia. Newman had written the Apologia as a response to a personal attack by Charles Kingsley, which I'm sure Mark and Patrick will talk about in a moment, who questioned Newman's honesty in his conversion to Catholicism. And in the I guess in the same way that the Apologia ends with Newman relinquishing his religious opinions for the truth of the Catholic Church, so does Loss and Gain, which seems to reveal so much more about its author's inner life, and perhaps more than Newman even intended. Because clearly the spiritual trials of the protagonist, Reading, mirror those of Newman himself, tracing his loss of confidence in evangelicalism and later in high church Anglicanism before describing his conversion to Roman Catholicism. In the conflated voices of its narrator and protagonist, Loss and Gain projects a composite of what Newman probably saw in himself, a sensitive, introspective man who, despite having become a Catholic, retains his Englishness, remaining a typical Oxford man, almost to the point of caricature, long after his conversion. And there's one scene in the novel where Reading is a priest that Reading meets later will comment, and he'll say, "You must be an Oxford man." And it's almost a self-conscious self-criticism, self-reflexiveness that brings attention to what is essentially the discourse of most of the novel, which is just within the smaller, insulated community of Oxford men versus the larger Catholic community that its protagonist discovers. So, just about a decade before writing Loss and Gain, Newman had cautioned his Oxford parish against the dangers of reading or writing novels. The Anglican Newman preached that by reading novels, even religious ones, quote, "we do mischief to the moral system within us, just as we might spoil a watch or other piece of mechanism by playing with the wheels of it. We weaken its springs and they cease to act truly." Suspicions about the corrupting influence of novel reading are almost as old as the novel itself. Newman's own position was that the reading of novels could lead to a dissipation of moral feeling at the expense of moral action. Despite this concern, Newman enjoyed reading novels. He praised Walter Scott, complained about Jane Austen, and he eventually overcame his moral scruples and wrote two of his own. Over time, Newman became less ambivalent about literary art. Several years after the publication of Loss and Gain, he would offer a qualified endorsement of literature in The Idea of a University. There, he argued that literature could have an edifying function by shining a light on man's sinfulness. Man, he says, is a being of genius, passion, intellect, conscience, power. He exercises these various gifts in various ways. In great deeds, in heroic acts, in hateful crimes, literature records them all to life. Newman's defense of literature then was both humanistic and instrumental, and his own novels both had non-literary purposes. He wrote Loss and Gain in response to what he says was, quote, a tale directed against the Oxford converts to the Catholic faith. That tale was Elizabeth Harris's From Oxford to Rome, published in 1847, which had been written to warn Anglicans about conversion to the Catholic Church, and which explicitly mentioned Newman. From Oxford to Rome was one of a number of anti-Catholic novels published in the mid-1840s. Another was written by Newman's fellow Tractarian, William Sewell, the novel Hawkstone, in 1845. Hawkstone is told from the perspective of a paternalistic English lord who makes it his mission to reassert the authority of the Anglican Church in his village. Anxieties about manhood, family life, and nation abound, as do conventional anti-Catholic tropes, such as troublesome Irish immigrants and menacing Jesuits, with disparaging references to the Oxford movement. And another example is Francis Trollope's Father Eustace, in which a protagonist heroine overcomes an oppressive Gothic Catholicism. Not only does Trollope's novel include a character modeled on Newman, but some have argued that the novel itself is the product of the author's interest in the Oxford movement. Well, Loss and Gain is both a response to Harris's novel and a corrective to anti-Catholic English novels of the past, novels that were neither theological nor ecclesiastical in their opinions of Catholicism, but employed motifs associated with the medieval religious tradition as symbols of superstition as opposed to the sacramental, irrational as opposed to the rational, and exotic as opposed to a more familiar English character. The anti-Catholic prejudice is an integral part of the English imagination at this time. At one point, Reading's friend Sheffield, hearing rumors of Catholic converts at Oxford, suspects a Jesuit plot and the secret arrival of the Pope himself on campus. Newman counters the absurdities of anti-Catholic literature by fictionalizing his conversations, his dialogues with his Oxford chums in a way that serves as a model for other potential English converts. This includes a parody of the popular conversion plot in anti-Catholic Gothic novels. But in this case, the conversion plot is not something tragic, but it's in the very sense comic. It has a happy ending. Loss and Gain, and in some respects Callista, are English Catholic interpretations of the novel of manners. Newman replaces the concern over the novel of manners concerns with customs and conventions and values of social life, with questions about faith and religion as the subject. That Newman characterizes his protagonists as having the social virtues ascribed to Englishness, as you would find in the novel of manners, is significant. For not only did it make his novels, and by extension English Catholicism, more appealing to Victorian readers, it also reflects his distinctively Catholic understanding of the value of literature. The novel of manners as a genre emerged in response to the Gothic novel. The Gothic novel, from its inception, as I point out, often contained these anti-Catholic themes, though there were some which indulged in a nostalgia for a medieval England. In fact, one of the characters in Loss and Gain says, there's nothing more Catholic than Rome, but of course it doesn't have any Gothic. The novel of manners countered this sentimentality with a conservative reinscription of class order in a time of social change. Loss and Gain shows how an Englishman of English sensibilities could ever possibly convert to Catholicism. Reading struggles with his feelings of loyalty to the Church of England, the faith of his father, an ideal that is dear to him, one that he associates with the English idyll of country life, where he goes on his vacations from Oxford back to his home in the countryside. The Bildungsroman has of Lossingen has its protagonist suffer an emotional loss that initiates this journey of growth. Thus, part one ends with the death of Reading's father, the loss of that idyllic home life, and a disillusionment with the idle dream that is the pursuit of truth, as Reading calls it. Anglicanism seemed to him then the most sensible course. But by the end of part two, Reading leaves Oxford and the Church of England behind to travel to London to be accepted into the Catholic Church. Eventually, what makes him an English Protestant, his loyalty to truth by inquiry, leads him to Catholicism. It also leads to his alienation from his circle of friends. These relationships are based on their proximity to each other at Oxford. His intimacy with Sheffield wanes as their interest in religious controversy declines. Sheffield, quote, was unblemished in his character, exemplary in his conduct, but he was content with what the perishable world gave him. Charles' characteristic was a habitual sense of the divine presence. He felt himself to be God's creature and responsible to him, God's possession, not his own. And we see here this contrasting with the empirical-minded Sheffield with the more loyal British subject of Charles Reading. Later, as Reading matures, he develops a more intimate friendship with the character of Willis, who earlier in the novel converted to Catholicism and eventually becomes a priest. He soon leaves Oxford. Reading soon leaves Oxford forever, and parts with his family and friends, not forever, but for a while, as he boards a train to London to be taken into the church. On the way, he encounters a priest who offers Reading spiritual guidance. He says at one point, "A man's moral self is concentrated in each moment of his life. It lives in the tips of his fingers and the springs of his insteps. A very little thing tries what a man is made of." Well, there's something poetic in the priest's description of the moral life, emblematic of the beauty that Newman found in the Catholic faith. Reading finds comfort in the words of the priest, a comfort that he could not find in the religious poetry of English writers like Cooper and Pope. This is the role of the priest. He is the teacher, the comforter, a paraclete inspired by God's grace. This regenerative dialogue takes place not in a confessional booth, but on a train, in a train booth. The locomotive being the great symbol of the achievement of the English Industrial Revolution. The invention that transported the nation from the vestiges of feudalism into a future where a rising middle class would inherit a new social, political, and economic reality. The priest goes on to say, "You approach the church in the way of reason. You enter into it in the light of the Spirit." Charles said that he feared there was a great temptation operating on many well-informed and excellent men to find fault with the evidence of Catholicity and to give over the search on the excuse that there were arguments on both sides. "It is not one set of men," answered his companion. "It is the grievous deficiency in Englishmen altogether. Englishmen have many gifts," the priest says. "Faith they have not. Other nations inferior to them in many things still have faith." It is in the voice of the priest that the novel self-reflexively criticizes its identity as the Oxford man's, as like the Oxford man, and by extension, the empirical mind of the Victorian Englishman. It is this dialogue that Reading has with the priest that opens Reading up to the affective interiority characteristic of newer novels, newer fictions of the self. It is not finding the conviction that is a belief in oneself, but venturing in the hope of receiving grace. And this threshold experience with the priest is what leads to Reading's conversion. But it's also where the novel makes a literary conversion. Up to this point, Loss and Gain marries, by way of parody, the liberal romantic and the conservative manner novels, reconciling these, which would be seemingly contrary forms, and showing how they're compatible. It is in the conclusion where the novel becomes converted. The penultimate scene in Lost and Gain shows Reading passing from intellectual preparation to the immediate emotional realization of the beauty and goodness of the Catholic Church, what he finds so powerful and almost, you could say, transformative or transcendent, is the humanity in the presence of God. There is something mysterious about it to Reading, but this gives way to his epiphany about religion. And I know I'm running a little long, so I'll read a little bit more from the novel. And this is in that penultimate scene where Reading arrives at the Passionist monastery and visits a Catholic church for the first time as an adult life. The church door came first, and as it was open, he entered it. It apparently was filling for service. When he got inside, the person who immediately preceded him dipped his finger into a vessel of water, which stood at the entrance, and offered it to Charles. Charles, ignorant of what it meant and awkward from his consciousness of it, did nothing but slink aside and look for some place of refuge. But the whole space was open, and there seemed no corner to retreat into. Everyone, however, seemed about his own business. No one minded him, and so far he felt at ease. Over one altar was a large old crucifix with a lamp, and this had a succession of visitors. At another, which was in a chapel at the farther end of one of the aisles, 6 long candles were burning, and over it was an image. On looking attentively, Charles made out at last that it was the image of Our Lady, and the child held out a rosary. Here a congregation had already assembled, or rather was in the middle of some service to him unknown. It was rapid, alternate, and monotonous, and as it seemed interminable, Reading turned his eyes elsewhere. They fell first on one, then on another confessional, round each of which was a little crowd, kneeling, waiting, everyone his own turn for presenting himself for the sacrament, the men on one side, the women on the other. At the lower end of the church were about 3 ranges of movable benches with backs and kneelers. The rest of the large space was open and filled with chairs. The growing object of attention at present was the high altar, and each person, as he entered, took a chair and, kneeling down behind it, began his prayers. At length, the church got very full. Rich and poor were mixed together. Artisans, well-dressed youths, Irish laborers, mothers with 2 or 3 children, the only division being that of men and women. A set of boys and children mixed with some old crones had got possession of the altar rail and were hugging it with restless motions and expectation. Let me see here. Let me continue. What particularly struck him was that whereas in the Church of England, the clergyman or the organ was everything and the people nothing except so far as the clerk is their representative, here it was just reversed. The priest hardly spoke, or at least audibly, but the whole congregation was as though one vast instrument, or panharmonicon, moving all together, and what was most remarkable, as it self moved. They did not seem to require anyone to prompt or direct them, though in the litany the choir took the alternate parts. The words were Latin, but everyone seemed to understand them thoroughly and to be offering up his prayers to the Blessed Trinity, the incarnate Savior. And the great Mother of God, the glorified saints, with hearts full in proportion to the energy of the sounds they uttered, there was a little boy near him and a poor woman singing at the pitch of their voices. There was no mistaking it, Redding said to himself. This is a popular religion. So here in this long passage, Newman expresses a democratic feeling for the commons, for community. And the way he does it is markedly distinct from the previous style of the preceding part of the novel, whereas before there were two other inherited novel forms. In this form, it's almost Dickensian. And for Newman, that would have been the newer style of novel, a Dickensian tableau of humanity. And in his description of the church, it is, as he says, it is very plain and bore the marks of being unfinished. It's much more English than it would be called, as termed at that time, Romish. So, Loss and Gain was meant to be controversial, and it was. Critics either loved it or hated it. But despite that, it was a very popular novel. In fact, it was a bestseller that, I guess, with Newman's notoriety coupled with the popularity of religious novels in the mid-19th century, this all ensured that Loss and Gain would find a wide audience, which was Newman's intent. He wanted to write a popular novel. His novel is what we would call today, what we might think about today as genre fiction, in the Catholic novel genre. Loss and Gain would end up going through 9 editions in England, 13 pairings by 1881, as well as 2 American editions. It was soon translated into French, Italian, German, and Dutch. 8 years later, Newman would have another success with Callisto. But I'll stop there. Just to sum up, the literary conversion then of Loss and Gain creates a continuity with the older forms of English novels and the newer novels, the novels of Dickens that are associated with the city of London, which is the Rome of the modern industrial world. The teleology of this literary conversion is the conversion of English culture. So it may cultivate English Catholics like Newman himself. Thank you.
So it's a pleasure to be with all of you, and I kind of feel honored to be part of this conversation. I came to Newman as a theologian, and then only afterwards as a professor of literature, studying the Catholic literary revival. And then, of course, as you said, the revival starts in some ways with Newman from the Oxford movement on. One of my professors at Stanford, Barbara Charlesworth, was a Shelley scholar, but she had this secret love for Newman. And so we had an entire course that we had to read all of Newman. So I'm going back to those days where I'm kind of excited about it. And part of doing this actually was thinking about, your graduate years. It was quite wonderful. So we read a lot of Newman, but we also read The Dream of Gerontius, this 900-line poem that he published in 1965 about the death of Gerontius, an allegorical everyman who is escorted by his guardian angel to the judgment seat of God and then on to purgatory to cleanse the stain of sin upon him before he's worthy of the eternal joys of heaven. I'm not sure a lot of people read this poem. Certainly Edward Elgar made it popular. It had a second life when it was made into an oratorio in 1900. It was made into, it was actually performed in 1910 at the anniversary of Queen Victoria's death with all of the royalty and all of England there. So it did have a kind of a second life there, although it's only about half of the poem that he uses. I was intrigued by the poem, though. Professor Michael Wheeler of the University of Lancaster did a history of its reception and notes that after Tennyson's In Memoriam, Newman's The Dream of Gerontius was the best known and most published poem about death during the Victorian age. And of course, purgatory is not something that you would kind of find in the English Anglican world. Article 22 calls it repugnant to the word of God. I was very much aware that a year before the Dream of Gerontius, he writes the Apologia. And it seems to me that these two works within a year apart are actually doing the same thing, but from two different genres. Because I like to read the Apologia as a kind of, take on Newman's integrity, but also in that sense of salvation anxiety. I'll use that word. And I think that the Dream of Gerontius is also about salvation anxiety as well. And so I think that in some ways he's negotiating some epistemological and ontological claims of the Christian faith in these two different genres. So as we all know, in the preface of the Apologia, Newman says he wants to respond to Charles Kingsley's charge that there is something incoherent, dishonest, duplicitous about his conversion. And he writes this kind of confessional work to show his personal honesty and integrity at the heart of leaving the Anglican Church. And the overriding metaphor of that epistemological argument rests on the sense of sight, of seeing, as sight as understanding, as sight as verification, as sight as almost this Cartesian thing. But in the midst of all that, you have these moments in it where he gets very personal. And in getting very personal and confessional, it's about death. I went back, when I taught this course, we did these two together in a graduate course. We went back to some of his early sermons, and I had no idea that Newman, he's preaching on death, and he's preaching on judgment, he's preaching on these things, something that I just never saw before in my limited reading of him. But in those moments of dread, you kind of get Descartes' cogito, this divine reality kind of subjected to one's mental ideas. Listen to his circular justification for his conversion. Quote, I am a Catholic by virtue of my believing in a God. And if I am asked why I believe in a God, I answer that it is because I believe in myself. For I feel it impossible to believe in my own existence, and of the fact I am quite sure, without believing also in the existence of him who lives as a personal, all-seeing, all-judging being in my conscience, unquote. So knowledge of oneself and of God is thus pressed into a tautology in which God seems to exist as an objective spiritual reality in the conscience of a subject. So in this very personal moment of self-disclosure, Newman is really kind of following that rationalist logic that the spiritual is located on the mental side of this great divide between mental and physical experience. God seems locked in the mind, a very special kind of mental idea. I have to say I don't get this from myself. This is Nicholas Slash looking at Newman as well. So what is interesting then is the most of Newman's Apologia really does work seriously to undermine that rationalism, that epistemology, what has historically been the domain of a Protestant theological epistemology of his time. It is only in these most personal moments in the text that one really sees that dread of being isolated and alone in the world and needing some certitude. It surfaces again most strikingly in this short discourse. Quote, I look out of myself into the world of men, and there I see a sight which fills me with unspeakable distress. The world seems simply to give the lie to the great truth, of which my whole being is so full. And the effect on me is, in consequence, as a matter of necessity, as confusing as if it denied that I am in existence myself. If I looked into a mirror and did not see my face, I should have the sort of feeling which actually comes upon me when I look into this living, busy world and see no reflection of its creator. Pretty salvation anxiety for me. Newman's struggle to see, to verify this primary truth of the faith, leads him into what he calls his winter of desolation, 1841 to 1845. And yet his turn to Catholicism in some ways reflects a turn from this kind of epistemological dilemma that so infected his day. So in the Apologia, we see Newman reacting against this problematic during his own spiritual quest, even as he admitted the power of this lens in his work in constructing his own reasoned discernment to convert. So if Cartesian thought is framed by the metaphor of seeing, of fostering some spatial character of ocular vision to create some false distance between mental ideas separated from physical experiences, if you read The Dream of Gerontius, again, 1 year later, he's writing this, it shifts the metaphor. It's no longer seeing, it's really about hearing. In the genre of poetry, about a soul's journey after death, the metaphor of seeing is framed as an experience of the trembling awesomeness of God's presence in proportion to the human soul. And it's this disproportion, which of course is an aesthetic as well as a moral judgment, gives credence to this doctrine of purgatory, the need for purification of a soul in order to stand more proportionately in the sight and the presence of God. It's interesting that the angel in the poem says that purgatory, quote, is a place without light in which to see. You're going to have to give up that epistemological claim in purgatory, apparently. Seeing God turns from epistemological consideration into a mystical one, into a loving gaze, indeed, a loving voice. Because the use of the word seeing in the poem is just reserved for this one moment of purgatorial judgment, Newman employs senses to render both an immediacy to the experience of the soul's journey, as well as an ecstatic kind of sense of anticipation for the climactic moment of sensing and seeing God. I think here Newman actually shows his romantic chops. There's a little bit of Coleridge and Shelley coming out here. Let me just read one of the most beautiful stanzas where the soul comments on the sounds and the smells before him. The sound is like the rushing of the wind, the summer wind among the lofty pine, swelling and dying, echoing round about. Now here, now distant, wild and beautiful, while scattered from the branches it has stirred, descends ecstatic odors. So now all this time the soul is trying to interpret what is happening. In many ways, the soul is trying to attempt its own status. But the soul realizes that this vision, this dream, is really beyond the truth claims of certitude and of verification. It states, the soul, thou speakest mysteries, still methinks I know, to disengage the tangle of thy words, yet rather would I hear thy angel voice than for myself be thy interpreter. It is as if the soul realized that the presence of God is beyond the task of subjective interpretation and gives into being wrapped up into the singing of the angels. Hearing, rather than seeing, becomes the operative metaphor for understanding experience. A sense experience that offers no dualistic notion of spatial distance from which to abstract subject from object. The poem offers liturgical formula, then, as the means to understanding. A liturgical formula. For ritual offers participation and union with others, and ultimately with God. And so I think these two works, the Apologia and the poem, work in tandem. The Apologia offers a confession of sorts built on rational assumptions, probabilities, about seeing as clarification, seeing as truth. While the dream of Gerontius, a year later, indeed offers us a dream, an aesthetics of presence, of hearing and listening closely to a heaven filled with ritual, song, and liturgy. And so I wanted just to say one thing that Paul, and that's what I'll end here. Graham Greene owned the collected works of Newman, and he scribbled in little words, sometimes really about his own novels, but he would sometimes scribble into the margins. And he scribbled a lot around the dream of Gerontius, which of course, as a Green scholar, that made my radar go off. And of course, Muriel Spark is doing an edition of his letters, and has the same scribbles, and then of course becomes a Catholic. And then of course, I'll have to come back to Flannery O'Connor, and Flannery O'Connor thought that the Apologia was a great work, and she hated the dream of Gerontius. So there you go. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And apologies, I'm getting over a cold and laryngitis, so my voice is sort of hoarse. I'm struck by the number of disciplines represented today, the rich tapestry of disciplines that have been represented in the various talks: theology, philosophy, ecclesiology, history, and now literature, and the different kinds of approaches, the different questions that we're asking from the perspectives from which we come of Newman. John Berkley mentioned Newman's multifarious roles and voices. And I also am starting to wonder whether perhaps we maybe also have different Newmans. We have sort of multifarious Newmans depending on how we're thinking about what it is that we're looking at and what the value is of it. The particular kind of literary critical tradition that I'm in tends to focus on how cultural objects, including literature, not only reflect, but also produce the way we're able to think about ourselves and the world. And so one of the things that I do is try to look carefully at specific textual moments that seem to be generative in that way. They give us figurations for how various kinds of issues could be thought at a particular time or by a particular person. And one that I've returned to again and again for a lot of years now, in part because it seems so complex, even compacted in its meaning, comes from the Apologia. And so in an act of shameless narcissism, I'm going to narrate a repeated return to this passage, or my repeated return to this passage, as a kind of wellspring for ideas that have been important to me over many years. And I'll present them in what I guess I'm thinking of as three provocations. The passage comes from near the beginning of the Apologia, in which a sort of narrative in which Newman relates an anecdote of Catholic identity formation structured through a textual encounter. And apologies for the long quotation. So this is Newman. When I was at Littlemore, I was looking over old copybooks of my school days, and I found among them my first Latin verse book. And in the first page of it, there was a device which almost took my breath away with surprise. Between verse and book, I have drawn the figure of a solid cross upright, and next to it is what may indeed be meant for a necklace, but what I cannot make out to be anything else than a set of beads suspended with a little cross attached. At this time, I was not quite 10 years old. I suppose I got these ideas from some romance, Mrs. Radcliffe's or Miss Porter's, or from some religious picture. But the strange thing is how, among the 1,000 objects which meet a boy's eyes, these in particular should have so fixed themselves in my mind that I made them thus practically my own. I am certain There was nothing in the churches I attended or the prayer books I read to suggest them. What strikes me in this passage, what's continued to strike me in this passage, is that what Newman is narrating is a kind of retrospective discovery of Catholicism, troped by his boyhood sketch of a kind of rosary that the adult Newman has forgotten producing in the margins of his school day copybook. I first came to this passage, and this is my first provocation, when I was working on the English Gothic during and after the Oxford movement. And I turned to it for its reference to Anne Radcliffe, the great author of late 18th century Gothic novels that Mark has described. What does the Gothic, I wondered, often considered, again, as Mark's noted for us, one of the most anti-Catholic modes of English writing, have to do with Newman's discovery of his own Catholicism? I think this might be a version of what Mark's calling literary conversion. Perhaps counterintuitively, the very anti-Catholicism of the Gothic as a mode, with all of its convents and sacramental secrets and medieval ambience, could become, for the 19th century, a paradoxical source for a Catholic revival that is perhaps mirrored in the designs for the rebuilt Houses of Parliament in High Gothic style in the 1830s through 1850s by the Catholic convert Augustus Pugin. The hint of anachronism in Newman's account of discovering Catholicism in the sketch of the boy he had been, who did not and could not recognize what he was doodling as the mark of Catholicism, echoes the anachronisms of the Gothic novel itself. And Newman's genealogy of his own conversion, and suggestively of 19th century the English Catholic revival itself, thus produces its own origin as a literary fascination with the Gothic as a genre. Later, I returned to this passage, this time thinking through its ramifications for Newman's understanding of his Catholicism as something always already present in the boy he retroactively narrates. Through his appropriation of the romantic tropes of Radcliffe and Porter, he says, I've made them thus practically my own, Newman establishes both his Englishness and his Catholicism as prehistory to his subjectivity. Despite his language of fixing these images in his mind, he cannot actually remember doing that, nor can he remember a time at which his mind itself was not already apparently preconditioned for that fixing. In fact, this retrospective production of subjectivity looks, avant la lettre, like what we would come to identify as the coming out narrative, what the lesbian theorist Biddy Martin has called a process of coming to know something that has always been true, a truth to which the author has returned. Newman's account, that is, depends upon some notion of what we would come to call the closet, in that it complicates the way we understand conversion, or in the words of Pope Francis, interior transformation, since Newman suggests that the boy's fascination with the rosary functions as a kind of proof only recognized in hindsight that he was somehow always already Catholic. Why did these images impress themselves upon my mind among the thousands I had seen? What was the sort of ground in which that seed took root in the mind of the boy? Cognate with what we have come to recognize as the genre of personal narratives of coming out as gay, the content of the fantasy proves the essential identity, but that content is only recognizable, can only be recognizable as the key element of the drama of subject formation after the fact. An event in the life of the child, apparently meaningless in itself, he's doodling, takes on meaning insofar as it ratifies the subjectivity of the adult. It is literally called into being by the imperatives of narrative, a narrative, as Biddy Martin suggests, that is always a narrative of return to a shrouded past. Most recently, this is my third encounter, I've been interested in the particular terms of emotion with which Newman frames this narrative encounter with the figure of his own childhood. In the first page of it, he writes, "There was a device which almost took my breath away with surprise." One of the most important influences on literary criticism of the past several years has been what's called affect theory, in which affect is described by the psychologist Sylvan Tompkins as the biological portion of emotion, and through which critics think about how the subjective experience of emotion functions physiologically, socially, culturally, and so on. Newman's surprise is what's interesting to me here. It's experienced like a blow of unexpected recognition that isn't really rational, but which, through its embodied phenomenology, leads to a kind of revelation. That seems to me to be incredibly interesting, particularly since Newman himself seemed to keep surprising people. There's Charles Kingsley, of course, whose attack on Newman in What Then Does Dr. Newman Mean takes the form of an extended, exasperated surprise. In the Apologia, Newman notes that Joseph Blanco White, a former Catholic priest, expressed astonishment that Newman, at the point that's being narrated, then still Protestant, would oppose Sir Robert Peel's 1829 efforts on behalf of Catholic emancipation, as Canon Chapman told us about earlier today. His sudden union with the most violent bigots, White observed, was inexplicable to me. Archbishop Boland described the tense relationship between Newman and Cardinal Manning, like Newman, a convert to Roman Catholicism. And Manning is reported to have asserted that Newman twists you round his little finger, he bamboozles you with his carefully selected words and plays so subtly with his logic that your simplicity is taken in. People seem to keep being surprised by him. More recently, in what I read as a signally symptomatic instance of a kind of refusal of openness to surprise, the late physicist and conservative Catholic theologian Stanley Yackey opened his 2000 book, Newman's Challenge, with a description of the way that Newman, in the winter of 1890, surprised a group of Protestant factory owners in Birmingham by not agreeing that Catholic workers should have to take part in Protestant Bible readings. For Yackey, this represents precisely the kind of adherence to what he frames as Newman's Catholic orthodoxy that should not be, but is surprising to liberals wanting to, in Yackey's perspective, co-opt Newman's legacy. This is Yackey. The old cardinal, Yackey declares, had done exactly the opposite of what a typical liberal would have done in the circumstances. Newman's character was indeed the very opposite of that which some contemporary portraits of him seem to convey. So in that case, the Protestant factory owners are surprised, but Yackey certainly is not surprised because Newman does exactly what Yackey thinks he should do. And throughout that book, which is a series of lectures, Yackey actually goes through a number of instances where he knows exactly what Newman would think about various things. From ecumenical dialogue, Newman would definitely be against it, from Yackey's perspective. The Anglican ordination of women and move away from, or sort of a decentering or de-emphasis on official theological homophobia, contraception, Vatican II. In one of the most startling moments, he knows exactly what Newman would think about the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. But by the middle of the book, Yackey himself has to work through his own bafflement in trying to figure out and explain away why Newman, in one instance, did precisely the opposite of what Yackey would have expected by opposing or at least feeling conflicted about the formal declaration of papal infallibility as dogma, again, as Archbishop Boland related. So what I want to end us with, and myself with, and at the conclusion of this, my third provocation of thinking about Newman and thinking about what Newman might do for us and for me as a literary critic, is proposing that we might take the possibility of surprise as our starting point with Newman. Not finding in Newman what we always already expect to find, as Yaki himself almost always does, but instead being open to the fact that he keeps on doing something far less predictable and far more wonderful than we could have imagined. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you, Mark Bosco, and thank you, Mark Gallagher. Mark Gallagher, you very powerfully brought out Newman's vocation as a writer. And Newman, whatever else he was doing, Newman was writing. There is in the president's office here the Ignatius Press volume of the parochial and plain sermons of Newman, and it's got to be this thick. And this is just one period of his life. It reminds me of Thomas Merton's preface to his the selected works of Thomas Merton that was published by Image in the middle 60s. Merton said, well, what does this summing up of 20 years of writing tell me? It tells me that I guess I'm a writer. I was a writer before I entered the monastery. I entered the monastery as a writer. I kept writing, and here I am, and I guess I'm going to die as a writer. Well, so Newman, the prodigious output, the variety of forms in which he worked suggests so clearly that whatever else he was a writer. You mentioned surprise, Patrick. I guess the surprise for me is that freshly converted, not just converted, but a celebrity convert, one of the most watched figures in intellectual life, if it could be called that, clerical life in England, would make as his first move a piece of fiction. It's as if James Comey came out, instead of writing a memoir about his dealings with the FBI and President Trump, did it all as a piece of popular fiction. Or is it? Patrick, because of your work in that area, can you give us a little context as to whether and how it was surprising that this was his first move after 1845?
If it's okay, I'd want to pass that to Mark Gallagher,
sure thing.
right? Because that's really your field, right?
Yeah. So, Newman is guarded, as you said. There's like a closet kind of form. I found that as well to the Apologia. If we read it as an autobiography, there are very few moments where he actually gets, as you point out, gets personal and reveals himself. Very brief. And they're scattered throughout this larger structure, this defensive structure of doctrine and theological argument. Looking at Loss and Gain, this semi-autobiographical, anonymously published novel, was his way, his modest way of presenting this story to the public.
So it became a bestseller without people knowing that Newman was the author?
Yes. In fact, it wasn't until much later in the 1870s, I think 1873, that he finally attaches his name to the novel and then adds a preface to it and with some notes about how this novel came about. So he's in so many ways he remains private, but he clearly wanted to share this story, and of course I read it as the run-up or anticipating the Apologia.
And was that because the subjectivity that you give account of, or the inner life of a Catholic convert, was not appropriate material for the public? Why publish under a nom de plume? Was it like the bell jar, that women weren't going to write about mental illness and put their own names on it in 1959, so they had to use a pseudonym.
Newman was very traditional in his literary tastes, and that's the convention of an older tradition to publish anonymously.
Walter Scott publishes
And yes,
anonymously,
yeah.
for
Yeah, right, good
example,
example.
right? As does Jane Austen, right?
Mm-hmm.
At the beginning of the 19th century. So I think, right.
So did I hear you right, Patrick, that essentially you were suggesting in your first provocation that English Gothic fiction was on the face of it anti-Catholic, and yet it had a thick Catholic milieu and furniture, much of it did,
right.
in such a way that it exercised the Catholic aspect of it, in spite of itself, was attractive to Newman.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I find it really, I mean, there are a number of different locations of the Gothic, and Mark talked about this as well, and different types of the Gothic, but especially Radcliffe's, where he locates this in Radcliffe and these novels of the 1790s, that would have make an argument, make a sort of like implicit argument against Catholicism. Catholicism is a sort of threat to a kind of English, to a kind of Englishness. But it's also true that she presents a Catholic world which can be sort of seductive. There's a passage in The Mysteries of Udolpho, which was her best-selling novel, where the heroine, whose name is Elie, is staying at a convent she's staying at a convent, and she's looking down at the convent, and when Emily's out in nature, her thoughts always go up in an individual way to God, the sort of the individual soul in relationship to God. And she's looking down at the convent where these nuns have been so kind to her, and the music starts to swell, and she realizes that it's so attractive. The nuns are so kind, the music is so beautiful, the experience is so evocative, that she too could be drawn in to Catholicism if she didn't recognize the conventual life as selfishness, as fundamentally selfish, and as fundamentally opposed to her ethos, to her kind of crypto-Protestant ethos, because of course she's a Catholic, right? Because it takes place in France, so she's nominally a Catholic anyway. But I think that Newman, in reading this, is also sort of, at least the adult Newman doesn't know where he got these images from, but he knows he read Radcliffe. And so kind of like thinking like, where did I get that from? Maybe it's a picture, but maybe it's that kind of like, it's the stuff that I got from the Gothic that somehow gets converted, right, into a source, in fact, of Catholic subject formation for him.
And it's also, Catholicism is always the temptation, right?
Yeah, right, yeah.
It's almost fetishized in these Gothic.
Yeah.
And so there is this sense of, and of course, the good English person goes back and says, whoa, I don't want to do that. I don't want to give in to that temptation. So a lot of that kind of is felt throughout those novels. And it seems to me that he's very much a part of that world, of using that and then turning it on its head.
Patrick, you've used in other contexts the word transgressive, and that it's easy for us to forget now that Newman is sainted, that to be Catholic in that period in England, it was a transgressive act. Hopkins didn't get to talk to his family anymore after he converted. Newman and lots of other guys lost their livings and had to move from Oxford to remote cities. They no longer went into buildings that they'd been in on a daily basis their entire lives. They went into new buildings they'd never seen before. There was almost a cross-dressing aspect you've mentioned to Catholicism at that time. And so in this sense, Catholicism seen as transgression in Gothic fiction is then actually transgressive in the lives of Newman and the Anglo-Catholics who go over to Rome. I'm putting this out for any of you.
And in Newman's second and last novel, Callista, he addresses that as as in the persecution and eventual martyrdom of his protagonist. So conversion. I mean, there's drama in conversion. That's why it is a novel. You really can't just begin with someone who has the fullness of faith. You need to get that's the ending. But I mean, we see this. We see Catholic novelists more recently talking more about like the day-to-day experiences. But yeah, with Callista, the drama is in the story of the martyr, and the experience of Callista as this marginalized figure, comes from Greece, is living in Consular Rome province of northern Africa, and she is experiencing the same kind of issues with her faith as anyone alive in England who was also Catholic. Her faith is like a series. It's described as a series of starts and stops, and she moves between and fluctuates between these two poles of doubt and faith. So for Newman, yeah, the experience of being Catholic is definitely transgressive, and with that novel Callista, it's also the experience of having faith in a world that's becoming increasingly secular. That novel it takes place in some sort of pastoral paradise that suffers, well, much like our own world, ecological crisis and catastrophe, and there's all these pagan and pantheistic beliefs, and the Christians are the ones who are the outcasts for not embracing in that version of secularity. Anyways.
I think that there are different ways of there are different sort of modes of a certain kind of dissidence or outsiderness to a dominant culture, and I wouldn't want to overstate a particular kind of transgressiveness of what Newman's doing, especially in relationship to, by the end of the century, something like the attraction of Catholicism to the English decadence, and someone like Oscar Wilde, right, where Catholicism does seem to be about a very kind of publicly transgressive performance that we get in Wilde. We might in some ways get in someone like Rafalovich. We get in the circle around Wilde. I think it might be a little different in the women who are Michael Field, but there's a sort of sense that by converting to Catholicism, you are in a very specific way taking on outsiderness, and that outsiderness is cognate with various other kinds of outsiderness that they're experiencing. I don't think that's quite what's going on with Newman, and what I'm interested in is what are the different figures for Catholicism, and therefore what are the different figures for conversion that are possible. And so to go back to Radcliffe, for example, like to be Catholic in Radcliffe seems to be to do certain things, like you lock up good proto-Protestant girls, right? Like that's what being Catholic is, right? It's less it's not so much about belief, but about a set of acts, and there are a series of figurations for it that are available around the time of Newman. That's maybe one. Another is citizenship, right? Is it something like being an English citizen in Russia, right? Do you sort of like carry with your citizenship with you, so you're a kind of outsider in a way, but in some ways you could take on a new citizenship, right? And taking on a new citizenship,
Roman Catholic citizenship? You
well,
mean?
yeah, but or Russian citizenship, right? Yeah, but or Roman Catholic citizenship, and in some ways that's a decision to enter into a different kind of polity, right? And you could do it for any number of reasons. You could do it for convenience, or you could do it for other things. I think that Newman is suggesting that there's something else going on, right? There's actually something that has to do with a kind of a sort of core, almost a sort of core of like identitarian subjectivity that goes way back, that actually kind of like questions whether it's conversion at all, or kind of belated recognition of something that's already there, and that I find really interesting as well, and quite different. It has ramifications, for example, for another set of terms that also come out of gay and lesbian studies. And that is whether a particular identity formation we think of as universalist or minoritizing. That is Catholicism something that anyone can do and anyone can kind of be, right, if they decide it?
In the way that Newman had,
Right.
he celebrated the popular religion aspect
right, the popular,
in
right.
the scene in Lost Game
Yeah,
that Mark
right,
read.
yeah.
Or is it something else?
Or is it something that some people, sort of like in the core of their being, are in some ways always already, right? And those are really different models of what it means to think of oneself as having a religious subjectivity.
Yeah, for Newman, the Catholic faith is a faith of the here and now, of the living presence. It is also a faith that draws strength from history, and he saw that as lacking in the Anglican Church, and he in saying that they begin with the Bible, we begin with the fathers, we begin with the Church, and
Then he did a lot of significant work to build up the history, or identify such history as that was there through the lives of the English saints,
absolutely,
and so forth.
Yes, and establish that continuity. I mean, in part, that's the way that he is, spreading the Catholic faith. But he sees that as, because we talk about him as a writer. We're talking about a man who was a controversialist, who was a satirist. He could be very sarcastic, but very confrontational, and so where the forms of the Gothic are describing and imagining Catholicism as retrograde, as a confusion of
I have a question for Father Mark about Flannery O'Connor and Newman, but let me park that and see if there are other questions from the audience first, because I'll always have another chance with Mark on Flannery O'Connor. Questions from any of you? Yes.
I'll make a pronouncement. Newman was a genius at hiding himself as well as revealing himself. Newman was a genius at hiding himself as well as revealing himself. And someone who wrote as much as Newman, of course, revealed himself in ways that he might not have exactly liked. I can remember being very shocked as a young fellow reading copies of the letters that went back and forth between Faber and Newman when Faber was forming the Brompton Oratory, and the invective with which Newman heaped on Faber for stealing a couple of his favorites from the Birmingham Oratory. I also think that there has not been a really astute psychological biography of Newman yet written. And I believe that it will involve going in, as I think you're hinting at, Professor O'Malley, Newman's sexuality. It's a very dominant motif, I think, in Newman's life, which has not been professionally and carefully explored. And of course, the problem is, what psychological framework will you choose to explore it? And then you're going to get into all those issues. But I, again, will tell you a story of being at the Birmingham Oratory in the late 60s as a novice, and my early Oratorian years. And a young fellow had come to the Oratory and published an article about Newman, and he mentioned in the article that Newman was buried in the same graves as Ambrose St. John, who was his great friend and companion, and I think the person he loved most in life. It created a huge ruckus in the Oratory, and we were sent out to the newsstands to take and buy all the copies we could of that, so nobody in the parish would read about this. That was, I was assured by people in Rome at the time of the process to canonize him, the biggest obstacle to his canonization. It was a very serious obstacle. And they investigated over and over again whether there was any indication of impropriety. I will remember, again, and this is my last story, going to the Brompton Oratory in the late 60s, again, a fellow in his middle 20s at that point, and finished my doctoral work and so on, but going there and finding, to my huge surprise, a deep amount of hostility towards Newman alive in that community still, with a great deal of dismissal of Newman's alleged virtues and so on and so forth. It ranged from very overt and very, very sharply, publicly hostile to muted and less so. But it was part of the history and story of that community, which went back right to Faber, I suppose, that Newman was not the great hero that people thought he was. So I'm looking forward to all my nods to Ian Carr and to Rod Strange and so on, to a really astute biography of Newman, which will cause a great deal of controversy, and people will not, all universally like it, but it is needed. It is needed. I take great consolation, by the way. I believe and think Newman is a saint, but oh, is he a nice human one for us academics?
Do you want to respond to that? Or?
No, thank you. I think that you're absolutely right. I think some of sort of various kinds of figures, kind of tropological figures of speech, for sexuality come through even in Kingsley's description of Newman's relationship to all those hot-headed young men who surrounded him and hung on his every word and waited for his, sort of his finger to touch their hearts, their individual hearts. And then Faber, of course, in Oxford Apostles, makes this claim relatively explicitly. I think from my perspective, and again, as the sort of literary and cultural history that I think I'm doing, what I want to be careful of is and again it has to do with surprise in a way, is being careful not to assume that because something looks like something that we recognize today, it is the whole thing, right? And there's a lot of conversation in my field about whether, for example, it's possible to whether it makes any sense to describe someone as gay before Oscar Wilde, right? That various kinds of things come together, right? So what I'm really interested in, though, is exactly what you're, I think, suggesting, is to go back and not take our labels, right, and put them onto Newman, but to be really open to the complexity of the figurations of affective fields that we might call something like desire, right? without our labels, but to think about the really complex ways and specific and historically specific ways in which something like desire is functioning and is represented.
Yes, Canon Chapman.
Just as a little follow-up on that, I don't know whether you have ever looked at Dominic James's work, because he's doing precisely that sort of sense of, it's same-sex desire, but it's not what we would call gay or whatever. It's not the acting on it. It's not the action. There's been a fixation on that, but it is the way and the milieu there that creates a sort of safe space. Yeah. And in many ways, Catholicism provided a safe space, as had Anglo-Catholicism beforehand. And the way that Anglo-Catholicism developed, especially with its aesthetics later, is it was very much that safe space for male unmarried men. And that was something that was highly suspect in Victorian England. So there's a lot of very interesting stuff being done at the moment.
We can speculate on Newman's sexuality, and of course sexuality is anachronistic to his, a good part of his earlier life. But we do know that Newman identified as celibate, right? And he, that in his time in England in the early 19th century was to say the least an aberration. Mm-hmm. That he includes a discussion about that, about the virtues of celibacy and loss and gain is significant. He's legitimizing the Catholic priest tradition, but it's his friend, it's the protagonist's friend who becomes the priest. We don't know. We don't see Charles Redding become a priest. So as if not to sort of make things, to make him more identifiable to a larger number of readers.
Drew, a question, and then why don't we take things out? Oh, there's two questions, Drew, and one in the back, and then we'll open things to a general conversation at a reception.
This is from Mark.
Mark.
No, yourself, I'm sorry. Mark Bosco.
Okay.
It's two quick questions. What was it about Gerontius, his emphasis on purgatory, that appealed to the Victorians? And secondly, what was the occasion for Flannery O'Connor's dislike of Newman?
Well, she liked some of Newman. She just didn't like that, I think. Well, and again, I'm extrapolating, putting a few things together for Flannery O'Connor. So that's my judgment on it. Because she made fun of purgatory all the time, and she has a couple of things about purgatory, although she did believe in it. I think purgatory, though, it was considered one of those articles, and that this was anathema to that. But at the same time, purgatory was this kind of sense of what happens now. I think purgatory answers that question of anxiety, especially to a mobile community, industrialized community, who's lost any kind of anchoring in small village life. And so I do think purgatory becomes more and more an interesting thing. It's surprising to me that after the Apologia, he would move right into that. But this was a kind of a way for him to understand a process of coming to God. I'm not a Newman scholar, and so I've really just used those two things together, talking about trauma and what kind of genres respond to trauma throughout the late 19th and early 20th century. So maybe my colleagues can say more about that. But in terms of Flannery O'Connor had the Apologia, and she spoke about that. She never spoke about Gerontius.
Question in the back.
This is for Mark Bosco. You made a few comments about the epistemological aspects of Newman's thought, and I was just curious, maybe perhaps you could unpack that, because he makes similar comments in the philosophical notebooks about conscience that's as close to his awareness as his lungs, which I think is echoing John Locke. So what's at stake there in terms of your proposal? You said he was Cartesian, which would strike me as a little little different, but I was just curious to know a little bit more about
Yes,
that.
and I get the Cartesian stuff from Nicholas Lash, so he speaks that way about Newman and the Apologia. But I think that I don't think that the epistemology, I don't think verification, I think that Cartesian sense of rationalism, I think he's saying that it doesn't go far enough. And so this whole thing of probabilism and, certitudes and building all this stuff is actually not enough. And so purgatory as a place where you can't see, you can't verify, you are kind of led by an angel and you hear angel choruses, becomes, I think, a better way or a different way for him to say, this is really what the life of faith is about. Not about verification, not about certitude, not even about proportionalism. Although he does speak about, a little bit in the dream. So that's what I think. I really am making the case that he can't go any farther, and he moves then into liturgical language. He uses into sounds and smells to kind of create what the presence of God really is, not about something in the mind, ultimately.
Quick question for Mark Gallagher. I'm mic'd right here, so good. Lost and Gain went through 9 editions. Are there dramatic changes in those editions?
No, not that I'm aware of.
He added his name to one of them, though.
Yeah, I think I know one of the changes is that the last 2 chapters there's like a very, very short final chapter in part 3, and that gets added to the previous chapter. But no significant revisions to that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good.
John, thank you so much for all you did to organize this.
Good.
Thank you to Professor Kino and Canon Chapman, Father O'Malley, and everyone else who took part. We'll have a reception in the room just behind the doors. Thanks again very much.
And thank you, Paul, for organizing this panel. Wonderful panel.